Anyway, did anybody see Noah yesterday? Do you know what I'm talking about? The movie got released yesterday. Yesterday was the national release in the United States and theaters across the country for the first time. That movie has created quite a stir even before it hit the screen. A stir among a lot of Christian groups for, as they put it, not only for its inaccuracy, but for its almost heretical license in portraying the people and the times of the flood. Turn with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. The producer of the movie Noah, whose name is Darren Aronofsky, while stating the movie is based on the quote-unquote story of Noah and the flood, as he put it, Noah is the least biblical film ever made. In interviews, Mr. Aronofsky approaches the Noah story as a great fable and has no reason to approach the story with any sense of sanctity or reverence for God and or the Bible. That's Hollywood for you. But if you think about it, their role isn't to preach and teach biblical record. That's not why Hollywood is in business. Their role is to produce movies and to make money. And with all of this controversy that's going on about Noah, my guess is more people are going to end up going to see it and they're going to make more money. So it ends up doing exactly what they wanted to do in the first place. All of this controversy is probably going to be producing more money for them than it ever would have of and by itself. Let's look at what Jesus Christ had to say about the times of Noah in Matthew 24, beginning in verse 3. A prophetic chapter of the Bible, a prophetic part of one of the most profound portions of prophecy in the entire Bible. Matthew 24:3, and now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when is all this going to happen? When will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" They wanted to know what was going to happen and how they could know it was taking place. And Jesus answered them and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceives you." The first response out of his mouth when they said, "What are the signs going to be?" is make sure you don't get deceived. Which means that Jesus Christ felt that the number one thing that's going to stop us from seeing and knowing when he's going to be there is deception. He says, make sure, take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, "I am the Christ," and will deceive many. Now, people have said that this is probably a dual way to interpret this would be many would be coming and say, yes, he is Jesus Christ, and they're going to deceive many with stories that they tell about that Jesus Christ. And some have thought that maybe even this says is Jesus Christ saying, maybe some people are going to actually say, "I'm Christ," because you could interpret it either way in this passage of Scripture. But no matter what's going on here, no matter what the reference was specifically, he's saying that the whole concept of me, Jesus Christ, can be used to deceive people. And it's going to be used to deceive people. And then he goes on in verse 6, and he said, "You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." I've been attending God's church for, 50 years, maybe 60 years. I started, my first introduction was in 1964. So it's been a lot of years. Almost every decade that I've been in the church, when we read this passage of Scripture, we've heard the question asked, have you heard of wars and rumors of wars? Every single decade you can say yes. So this has been going on for a long time, and I believe sometimes this kind of thing goes on in the prophetic realm, and it's used to lull people to sleep. God says there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. Well, we've had wars and rumors of wars since 1964, 1954, 1944, 1924. You can pick a decade. But the key is this. When that starts escalating, when wars and rumors of war start escalating, and I read through the paper almost every day, and I just look at all the headlines in the first page, second page, third page, in the whole main section. And I am amazed at how many times and how many days The headlines are talking about some kind of war going on somewhere that we don't even know about. So there's a lot going on now, and it's going to get worse probably, but it may still just be the same. It may just be wars and rumors of wars still going on all the time. He said, but don't get troubled when this is happening. Well, not only do we not get troubled, we start going to sleep about it. We don't even think about it anymore. We have major traumas going on around the world. We don't even know what's happening, let alone be worried about it. He said, but these things have got to come to pass, but the end is not yet. In verse 7, he says, for nation is going to rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there's going to be famines. And now that's another issue that is a little more troubling because you hear of it sometimes, you don't hear of it at other times. Pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And by the way, they had another 5.1 in Los Angeles yesterday. And this kind of stuff, he said, pay attention to this. Wars, rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, famines, pestilence, earthquakes. When you start seeing a proliferation of this, know something's going on. Jesus Christ told us 2,000 years ago, look for this. Pay attention to this. Don't blow it off. Don't say, oh yeah, don't get, warmongering and all this kind of stuff going on, because we start then making no value of what God's word is. He said, in all this, in verse 8, he said, all these are just the beginning of sorrows. Then, after all this takes place, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. So there's coming a period of time when God's people all of a sudden are going to be at the forefront of what's going on in the world. People are going to start hating us, maybe because of the prophecies we predicted, maybe the times we're talking about, maybe the way we're preaching and teaching. I don't know what's going to bring it about, but it is going to happen. He said, you're going to be hated by all nations for my name's sake, and then many will be offended. That probably means both in the church and out of the church. Many will be offended and will start to betray one another and will hate one another. Things are not going to be pretty. And then many will hate one another. Then many false prophets, in verse 11, will rise up and deceive many. Who gets deceived? Can you deceive somebody that doesn't understand the truth? Yeah. But really, what's he talking about? Deceiving means you know the truth, you understand the truth, and somehow, some way you got led away from that. I think this is more applying to people that know God's truth and know God's way of life as opposed to people who don't. He said, then many false prophets will rise up and deceive many, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. We thought that was starting to culminate back in the 70s when I was a student at Ambassador College because of all that was going on in the world. We were wrong. We weren't as wrong as Paul was, though. Paul missed it by 2,000 years. We just missed it by 30 or 40. As we argued over the years in and out of the church just how close we are or we aren't prophetically, when you look at these guidelines that Jesus Christ gave us to watch, it's worth paying attention to. That's the point that I'm making here this morning. Drop down to verse 36. Jesus carries on with this dialogue about the end of the age and what the times would be like for those still living when that happens. Matthew 24, verse 36, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. Jesus Christ said elsewhere, I don't even know when that's going to happen. God has reserved that to himself. He said, but, now this is important to understand, but as the days of Noah were, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them away, so also will be the coming of the Son of Man be. Basically what he's saying here, people got so used to what they were living with, the environment in which they were living, the chaos, the confusion, the debauchery that they were living with, the deception that was going on. it became so mundane to them that all of humanity just, yeah, this is normal. Here we are, 2014. What's normal? Think about it from this perspective. What's normal today versus what was normal in 1974? Big difference. Huge difference. Huge. Enormous. Monumental. See, norm evolves. And that's what happened with the people during the days of Noah. The norm evolved into a trench of debauchery. And everybody they were okay with it. They were eating and drinking, having food, going out to dinner, going out to drinks, having parties. They were getting married. They were giving their children away in marriage, taking in marriage, coming and going. And it was going like that, and everything was hunky-dory until all of a sudden, wham! The ark closed. The rain started, and they died. That's what Jesus Christ is trying to tell us right here. So we see here a direct reference to the days of times of Noah and the flood. There's a correlation being made to then and to now and to the end of the age. Then Christ explains a little bit more with a couple of other comments in verse 40. He said, then 2 men will be in the field. Now he's talking about the end of the age. One will be taken and the other one's left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. One's going to be taken, the other one's left. They go to work that day thinking everything's the same. One's gone, one's not. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. Now is he saying you're going to know the hour by watching? No. What he's saying is at least you'll have a sense of something's happening. And you can prepare yourself mentally and emotionally, maybe if no other way, maybe even spiritually. He said, but know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour, not that you don't know, at an hour that you do not expect. So that throws a whole new monkey wrench into this thing. We think, because we know prophecy, we can pretty much guess about when. And we can think, well, it's not going to happen because of this, or it is going to happen because of that. And he said, when you think it's not going to happen, that's when it's going to happen. The warning is what? Be ready. Be ready. Let's go to Luke 17. I flipped to it with one turn. Magical. I must be growing in righteousness or something. I would imagine the warning means different things to different people. Here in Luke, it is expanded on just a little bit. Christ is telling us that we need to pay attention to how it was during Noah's days. Let's look at Luke 17, beginning in verse 26. We'll see a familiar wording to what we just read in Matthew. Luke 17, verse 26. And as it was in the days of Noah, so it shall be also in the days of the Son of Man. They ate, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark and the flood came and destroyed them all. So we see the times of Noah being referenced here again in Luke. But then he goes on and references other similar situations for us to pay attention to and to equate with. He said, I'm not just giving you one example, I'm going to give you several examples here. He said, likewise, in verse 28, as it was also in the days of Lot. Well, now we're moving forward in time after the flood. In the days of Lot, they ate, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, and they built. Life was normal. They were going on with life like it was totally normal. They had been lulled into a sense of normalcy. But on that day, when Lot went out of Sodom, that same day, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed every living creature. Not unlike what happened with the flood. Even so will it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. Okay, now we've got 2 examples. about what it's going to be like before Jesus Christ returns. Think about what he's saying. Life is going on in what they would have called normal. Then seemingly, all of a sudden, they were killed. Just like that, it was over. Let's go back and take a look at the days of Noah in Genesis 6. All the way back to the beginning. Genesis chapter 6. Noah and the ark is probably one of the most discussed and quoted stories in the Bible told to children as they grow up. I can remember reading it from the Bible, reading it from children's books, reading it from other different things to Joe and Jess when they were growing up. Reading to our kids about the story of Noah and the ark was probably done to and by many of us still sitting here in this room. One such time, a grandchild was sitting on her grandfather's lap listening to the Bible story of Noah's ark. When she asked, "Were you in the ark, Grandpa?" He chuckled and replied, "Why, no, I wasn't." There was a pause, and then the child looked up at him quizzically and asked then, "Why weren't you drowned?" Out of the mouths of babes. I would imagine that not many really understand what was going on back then in the days of Noah and why that event actually came into reality. But one thing we do know, Jesus Christ said, however it was back then, it is going to be like that again. It is going to be replicated. It's going to be repeated. Let's pick up the dialogue in Genesis 6, verse 1. Genesis 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, and the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, for all whom they chose. And the Lord said, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. He's not spirit. Yet his days shall be 120 years. So it seems like back then, prior to the flood, God had allocated man to live about 120 years. Later on in the Bible, he says it's about 70. So he lopped off 50 years. Verse 4, there were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Some have tried to make something more out of this than just giants. The original Hebrew is Nephilim, and that it just means giant men. That's all it means. It's not angels, it's not demons, it's not some other crazy thing. It's just big men. And they existed back then, and their lineage somehow got through the line of Noah, and they came out, and that's probably who David fought. It was one of these Nephilim. Verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That had become the norm. Mankind had evolved so far emotionally, spiritually, physically, mentally, intellectually, that kind of behavior was normal. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. God said, "I'm sorry I ever made him." I mean, think about those of us who have had children. To think about what it would take for you to say, "I wish you were never born." That's basically what God's saying. The way man turned out was so bad. God was like, "What? How can he be this bad?" Pretty sad state of affairs for all things living that God created. God said, "I just wish I'd never even made him." So he says in verse 7, the Lord said, "I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them." God lumped everything together Everything that breathed on the earth that God created, he said he wished he never created. Which means that not only had man polluted man had polluted everything. Even the creatures that were on the earth got messed up somehow. And God wanted to destroy everything, get rid of it all. Verse 8, but as we heard in a recent sermon, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. He found favor in God's eye. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Remember we discussed what walking with God meant? Living by God's commands, living by God's guidelines, living in a way that pleases God, living in a way that is like a child trying to please a parent. Living that way is walking with God. That's probably why he found grace in the eyes of God. Because he was trying to live the right way. Just like you, just like me. We try, we don't always succeed, but we're trying, and God sees value in that. And that's what he saw in Noah. And in verse 10, and Noah begot 3 sons. So he tells us about his lineage here a little bit, and Shem and Ham and Japheth. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. That was the norm. Everybody was accepting that. It's like certain parts of this country, certain parts of this world that we live on, this earth. You can go to certain communities, like Lagos, Nigeria, which has been declared many times over the past decade or two as the most dangerous place on the planet to live. It's the norm there. People who live in Lagos, Nigeria, it's normal. They just accept it as that being the case. You go to ghettos around this country, it's their norm. It's what they've gotten used to. It's what they've got accustomed to. It's what they grew up in. They don't know anything different. And that's what happens to man after a period of time. We just degenerate into accepting a norm that is lower and lower and lower. So God said the earth was corrupt before God. The whole earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. All flesh. Not just man. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me. I'm going to kill them all. For the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth that I created. I created the earth for them, and then I created them. They corrupted the earth. Now I'm going to use the earth to destroy them. And God's going to destroy man and everything else. Verse 14. He said, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch to protect it against the waters. And this is how you shall make it. And he gives them the details. The length of it shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. By the way, a cubit is about 18 inches if you want to figure out how big this is. You shall make a window for the ark, not multiple windows, a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above, and set the door of the ark on its side. So there's going to be one entrance and one window on this ark. The window is going to be 1 cubit from the top, and the door is going to be on the side of the ark. You shall make it with a lower, a second, and third deck. So it's a triple-tiered decking for this ship that they're being built. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that breathes air. This is not just about man. Everything that breathes air, everything that is on the earth is going to die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, all the stuff that God said he's going to kill, he said, of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female. So he's got to bring 2 of every living creature on the earth. Every kind of bird, anything that breathes air. He's got to bring 2 of each of them on the ark. And now God's given him a responsibility. He said, now you've got the responsibility to preserve life. You have to preserve all life. It's going to be in your care, Noah. Of the birds of their kind, and of the animals after their kind, and of every creeping thing of the earth after its kind, 2 of every kind will come to you to keep them alive. They're going to come to you, Noah, and they're going to expect you to keep them alive. It's like a little puppy coming to you, jumping up into your arms and saying, take care of me. And you shall take for yourself of all food that is eaten, and you shall gather it to yourself, and it shall be food for you and for all of them. So as you gather food, Noah, keep in mind you need a lot more than you would normally need. You're going to have 2 elephants, 2 hippopotami, etc., etc. And they eat a lot. So he said, this is going to be quite an undertaking for Noah and his family. And now this is Noah, who grew up in this norm of society that was wicked and evil and violent. And God's telling him, okay, when you're going to build this gigantic ark, and can you imagine the first dialogue that God and Noah had about this? I love Bill Cosby's rendition of it. Noah, yes, I want you to build an ark. Who is this really? It's like, who in their right mind is going to ask me to build an ark up here in the middle of nowhere? For what reason? So there's dialogue that took place between Noah and God. And then now God's given him all these details, and Noah's probably thinking, what in the... Are you for real? Can you imagine the faith it would take to move forward with something like this? But then in verse 22 of Genesis 6, thus Noah did. According to all that God had commanded him, so he did. So we see this man Noah and his family of 8 have been spared, being, if you will, passed over by God when the rains came. Not only were they passed over, those that were not protected in the ark were all killed. Every man, every woman, every beast of the ground, bird of the air, everything that breathed air died. This involvement in the ark was sort of like a baptism, if you think about it. They got put underwater for 40 days and 40 nights, didn't they? God said, don't even open the window for those first 40 days and 40 nights. You'll drown yourself if you open that window up. But then they all survived being essentially under this water for all those many days. Let's continue on in chapter 7 and verse 1. We just read that God had Noah preserve every creature that had been created with breath in it. In other words, God calls it the breath of life. Okay? When we think about the breath of life, we think of God breathing in the man and giving him breath of life. God did that with every creature that ever lived, that ever was created. And having that breath of life was something special because it came directly from him. He gave that life to them, and then they polluted it. But there was more in this delineation spelled out in chapter 7, verse 1 of chapter 7 of Genesis. Then the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you, now he's changed it a bit, 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female. Interesting terminology. God is basically saying, I'm going to pair them up. And she is going to be his, like marriage. So he said, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. So now God makes a delineation between the clean and the unclean animals. Also 7 each of birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of all the earth. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made. So God basically gave him 7 days to load the ark once it was finished. These were his final marching orders. The ark's probably finished now. When he's talking to him the second time, he said, now I made a little change here, not just two of a kind. You're still going to bring two of a kind, but all the clean ones, you've got to bring 7 pairs. That includes giraffes, by the way. It seems like God gave him a week to bring the animals on board. But it's interesting how the animals came on board. And Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. Now, Noah was 600 years old when the flood waters were on the earth. So he outlived the 120. Do you know who Noah's grandfather was? Methuselah, the oldest man who ever lived, 969 years. So Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood, of clean animals, of animals that are unclean, of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, creeps on the earth. 2 by 2 they went into the ark to Noah, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. Notice, Noah didn't lead them into the ark, they came into him. Noah stood at the door of the ark and the animals came to him. It was like they were drawn to him. This is supernatural. God supernaturally brought 7 pairs of clean animals, 1 pair of all the unclean animals, and marched them right up to the ark. They came unto the ark to Noah. And then listen to the specificity of when the flood started. Verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, on that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. And the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. It poured. People would say, how can you flood the earth with rain for 40 days? Well, there was more to it than that. God opened up the earth and let water come gushing out of the bottom of the earth as well. The rain came on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and on the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and their 3 wives of his sons, them, entered the ark, they and every beast after its kind, all cattle after that kind, every creeping thing that creeps on the earth after its kind, and every bird after its kind, every bird of every sort. And they went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which the breath of life. God must have used some kind of miraculous thing that drew those creatures that breathed the breath of life to Noah. It must have been like they were leading them to their Creator or something like that. So those that entered, male and female of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and the Lord shut him in. God closed the door. God, once Noah and his family and all the animals were in the ark, God then lifted up the door and shut it. Shut him in. And who knows, he may have sealed it from the outside. God had this thing covered. God was in control of everything. But God was asking a man to do something that was basically insane to take place. In other words, the entire earth became covered with water. The Lord shut him in. Now the flood was on the earth for 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. So the boat was floating above the highest peaks of the earth. That's how deep the water in the earth became. In other words, everything was covered with water, and every breathing creature, including man, was now dead. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under the whole heavens were covered. In other words, there was nothing that was not underwater. Which is of no surprise when you climb on some of the highest peaks on the earth, you can find fossils. Ocean-bearing fossils. Seashells on the tops of great mountains. How can that be? How does one explain that without this? So the waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface. The waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, until the whole heaven, under the whole heavens, the high hills were covered. Verse 20, the waters prevailed 15 cubits upward, and the mountains were covered. So they were covered with 15 times 1.5 feet. What's that, 22.5 feet? So the highest peak on the earth was 22.5 feet below water. That's how deep the water was on the earth. So Mount Everest was 22 and a half feet below the ark when they were at their peak. What else happened here? What happens when somebody climbs Mount Everest? They run out of air. Now we're 22 and a half feet above that, and everything's hunky-dory. They weren't wearing oxygen masks, I'll bet you any money they weren't. Maybe it was a pressurized ark. Something else miraculous had to have taken place. And all flesh, in verse 21, died that moved on the earth, birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every single human being. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. Now we're getting some definition about what this breath of life is. It's the spirit of the beast. The breath of the Spirit of life. That makes me wonder, it makes me want to ask God, I know there's a spirit in man. Is there a spirit in Lily, my dog? If you read this, you'd almost have to say yes. There's something special. There's something very unique to God, because God gave them the breath of life. So he destroyed all living things in verse 23, which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping thing and bird of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Took it 40 days to get there, to that depth. After it got to that depth, it stayed at that depth for 5 months. So now we're talking 4, 5, 6.5 months that they're in the ark, water coming, water sustained. 6.5 solid months inside this ark. No open doors, no open windows, no open air, just lots of animals and stuff that animals have. And all the nostrils of the breath of the Spirit. Okay, where was I? Verse 21. To you. Waters prevailed 100. So for 5 months, the earth was buried underwater. God then causes the winds to dry the earth, and the air starts. The water starts evaporating. Land starts appearing. What's going to appear first? Mount Everest. It makes sense. The first thing that's going to appear is Mount Everest. And if they're not near Mount Everest, they're not going to see that. Then the next thing is what's K2 or whatever the second tallest mountain in the world is. That's going to be the next thing that's going to appear. And it's going to be gradual. We're talking about how many feet of water? How tall is Mount Everest? Anybody know? 29,000 feet. 29,022 feet is how deep this water was. That's how much water had to recede. 29,000 feet of water. How many miles is that? That's a lot of miles. So this took time to dry up the earth. So let's go down to chapter 8. And we see the land is now dried up sufficiently where it can sustain life. So not only would it have to dry, but the seeds would have to start sprouting. The trees would have to start growing again because they were underwater for 7, 8 months, 9 months, whatever it was. So God told Noah then to finally leave the ark. Chapter 8, verse 13. And it came to pass in the 601st year, so almost a year's gone by, in the first month, in the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. So they were in the ark for almost 10 months with this whole episode taking place. A long, almost a year. And in the second month, in verse 14, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was fully dried. So another month and a half went by, almost 2 months. Then God said to Noah, saying, Go out of the ark, you and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply. You got to replenish the earth. All over again. It happened during the days of Adam and Eve. Now it's happening again during the days of Noah. They got a head start there. There's 8 of them versus 2. He says to be fruitful and multiply. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, and whatever creeps on the earth, according to their families, all went out of the ark. Remember the 7 pairs of clean animals? We're going to lose a lot of them the very first day. Verse 20. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings to the Lord. So one of them's gone, right like that. Instead of there 14 of them, now there's 13 of each clean animal. And the Lord smelled the soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, listen to this, I will never curse the ground for man's sake. Although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, he's talking about mankind, nor will I ever again destroy every living thing as I have done here. That's a promise. God says, I'm never going to destroy every living thing on this earth ever again. So when people start talking about apocalypses and this asteroid's going to hit the earth and destroy it, it ain't going to happen. The Bible says it's not going to happen. God says he won't let that happen. While the earth remains, as it's still intact in its present form, because we know the form's going to change when God finally comes down to the earth. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest are going to continue, cold and heat are going to continue, winter and summer are going to continue, and day and night shall not cease. In other words, it's going to go back to its norm. The earth is going to start rotating like normal and doing like normal, and everything's going to be happening. This was a promise that most people, I would guess, are completely unaware of. God says this is not ever going to change now. He put this in motion. He said that will never change as long as this earth is still here. The seasons would continue as normal. The earth is not going to be obliterated of all of mankind and everything killed by anyone or anything ever again. Chapter 9 and verse 1. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Drop down to verse 8 of chapter 9. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, and as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, which includes everybody sitting here in this room. This covenant that God made that day was made with us too. Verse 10, and with every living creature that is with you. God didn't just make this covenant with man. This is the first time I ever realized this. I've probably read this 100 times, maybe more. This covenant that God made was not just with man. It was made with every living creature that has the breath of life in it. The birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God says, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations, forever. This is an eternal covenant between God and everything that breathes, not just man. I am going to set my rainbow in the cloud. This was the sign of the covenant. It shall be for the sign of the covenant between me, and not you, me and the earth. See, God created the earth for man. And the earth being created for man was also created for man to get ready for God to make it his home eventually, when the new earth is established. See, the earth is very special to God. Unbelievably special to God. so special that everything that he created has the breath of life in it, he called it earlier the spirit of the breath of life, is very special to him. And he wants us to pay attention to it that way. I just read in the paper this morning about this guy who had this pit bull and just brutalized this poor dog. Beat him up, broke his skull, broke his nose, broke his legs, punctured wound him, starved him, chained him, whipped him, beat him, kicked him. Trying to teach him to be a tough dog, I guess. He's going to prison for 16 years. You know, I bet God would have punished him like that too. Keep in mind, the dog's got the breath of life. It's one of these creatures that fall under this covenant with God. This is undeniable. And I think this is powerful. I set my rainbow in the cloud, it shall appear before you as the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. It shall be, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the rainbow shall be seen in the cloud. And I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. The water shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. The rainbow shall be in the cloud, and I will look on it to remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth. This is an incredible, incredible covenant. I believe it's a covenant that we as man fully don't understand. Because God made a covenant not just with man. All the other covenants that we've ever talked about and discussed all through history is between God and man, God and man, God and man. This is way bigger than that. This is God and man and every living creature that breathes. So God set in motion rainbow as a sign that he said he would never use the flood to destroy every living creature on the earth again. Interesting, it is a covenant not just with man, it is a covenant with every living creature, all flesh that is on the earth. You know, the Peanuts characters even learned this lesson. A Peanuts cartoon pictured Lucy and Linus looking out the window at a steady downpour of rain, something like us today. Boy, said Lucy, look at that rain. What if it floods the whole world? It will never do that, Linus replied confidently. In the 9th chapter of Genesis, God promised Noah that would never happen again, and the sign of that promise is the rainbow. Phew, Lucy said, you've taken the load off of my mind. Sound theology, pontificated Linus, has a way of doing that. He knew the truth, and he knew that was an impossibility. Indeed, sound theology can do that. It can provide peace of mind. 2 Peter 2, at the other end of the Bible. 2 Peter chapter 2. There are some powerful lessons in the story of Noah and the ark. Lessons that actually play into the upcoming Passover season. Lessons that are tied to other dramatic events that have taken place in history as well. Remember the lesson that we learned about God is the only one who really controls true vengeance? Heard that in a couple of sermons a few months ago. He has told us that the ungodly will get what's coming to them eventually. He's got that all under control. And he's trying to tell us, don't you worry about the vengeance side. You just take what comes your way, try to deal with it the best you can, and let me take care of the retaliation. I will take care of it. He has told us that the ungodly would eventually get what's coming to them. This too is woven into the story of Noah, if you look at it for what it is. Let's look at 2 Peter 2, verse 4, and listen to how Peter puts it. 2 Peter 2, verse 4. He said, for if God did not spare the angels who sinned, we're going way, way back in time, way before man, probably before the earth. So if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah one of the 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly. So now we got 2 examples where God took care of what needed to be taken care of, and turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked around him. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. It made Lot sick. Okay, we heard what Jesus Christ said it's going to be like in the end, didn't we, earlier in the beginning of the sermon? When you read the news, when you listen to the news, when you see what's going on in the world, when you see the raping taking place, the child abuse taking place, the beating, the killing, the maiming, the brutalization of humanity, does it make you sick? Verse 8 again. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing their lawless deeds. It made Lot sick. Then the Lord, if God knows how to take care of all that, the angels, the corruption during Noah's time, the corruption of Sodom and Gomorrah during Lot's time, if God knows how to do that, then the Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of the temptations and to reserve the unjust under punishment for the day of judgment. Yes, if we pursue a righteous life like Noah or Lot, God will deliver us out of the horrible crap that we're living in, that we have to live with. He will also take care of the ungodly, creating all that nonsense and that mess in which we live. And he'll do it at the right time, the perfect time. So get ready to close. Turn back a few pages to 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter, maybe 2 pages. Here Peter will bind the story of Noah and how he and his family had to endure prior to the flood to how we endure for our salvation now. 1 Peter 3, verse 18. 1 Peter 3:18. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive by the Spirit, by whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison, who formerly were disobedient. Then, when once the divine long-suffering waited in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built, he was tortured by living, he had to live in all that period of time. And can you imagine the mockery that must have taken place? You're building an ark in the middle of, are you a nutcase, Noah? Yeah, we know you're a nutcase. Look at you, you do the Sabbath stuff. You do the holy day stuff. You are a nutcase. We just didn't know how nutty you were. He probably got tormented for all those years, all those days he was building the ark. While the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. Interesting wording about the long suffering while the ark was being built. There is also, verse 21, an antitype which now saves us. Baptism. Not the removal of the flesh, filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God. Angels and authorities and powers having all been made subject to him. Jesus Christ is our ark builder. Our means for salvation. Like those animals trekked into that ark, they went to Noah. Jesus Christ says, come to me. Come to me, and I will take care of you. I will provide for you. I will save you. I will spare you. One last scripture, Hebrews 11. He is the one who brings us up renewed from the waters of baptism to a new way of thinking and a new way of acting. Hebrews 11, just a few pages back to your left. As you remember, Noah was called a preacher of righteousness. He believed God and made it known by his actions every day of his life. He was warned of what was coming, and he believed God enough to go ahead and build this ridiculous ark in the middle of nowhere. He did it anyway, on dry land. Sometimes we too are ridiculed for taking a stand of righteousness in our lives, in the midst of doubters and even mockers. That's okay. You're in good company. Really good company. Really, really good company, including Jesus Christ. Let's read in Hebrews 11, one verse only, verse 7. Hebrews 11, 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, I'll say, moved with godly fear, prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is according to faith. By faith, Noah listened to God's warning about what was going to take place, even though it seemed so far-fetched. He did what he needed to do. He did what he was asked to do. Just like we need to listen to God's and Jesus Christ's warnings and guides, believe them, and do what we need to do. Have a great Sabbath.